So I want to just switch gears back to you, in your background in tech and artificial intelligence. How did that shape your view on Judaism, or is it the other way around? And do you find that this is an important subject to kind of delve into because there's a lot of implications for the religion in any way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I see it broader as really the topic of science and Torah, because I don't really like making a distinction. So we've tended to see, and Hacham Paul says that, this compartmentalized view of reality, it's a polytheistic view of reality, where you have science as one category, Torah as another category.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, the way to kind of overcome that, and people always say, oh, but that's in the field of science. The way I always overcome that is, who created gravity? Who created the cells of the body? Who created these evidential facts, like this actual reality, not theoretical stuff? Who created that? Was it some demon? Was it some separate thing, or is it the author of the same text that you're claiming to adhere to? So that's why the motto of the Habura in many ways is the author of the Torah is the author of the world. So, but we just say that, but we don't actually take it to its logical conclusion. If the author of the Torah is the author of the world, and you genuinely do hold that the world is the creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how can you not connect the two? It's like you have a wife, a partner that you're in love with, right? And they are expert in writing and expert in singing, but you just focus on the writing and you ignore the fact that they do any singing at all, right? How does that exactly work? If you genuinely love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is it's essentially a halacha, it's yoter mizeh, more than the love that you have for women, Harambam says, should be the love that you have for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How could this compartmentalization occur? So for me, I don't necessarily see it as influencing one or the other. I see it as the source is the same. Theory is theory. Reality is reality. The fact that certain realities like gravity was discovered by a non-Jew makes no difference to me, because gravity is not Newtonian. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? It just happens to be that someone discovered it. So my history or my development in the AI world, as I said, it developed from being in biomedical sciences. I work in medtech and in voice technology. And for me, the biggest connection that I see in my day-to-day work is that in conversational AI, which is essentially like the Google Assistant and the Amazon Alexa that you see, speech creates realities. So you say something and things come to be. And for me, that's the whole of Bereshit, the idea that God spoke and things came to be. And we see with Homo sapiens, which is essentially how many of our Hachamim hold, was Adam. When we say Adam Arishon, it was the first thinking man, the first man with sechel. So Homo sapien in scientific language. Pre-Homo sapien was obviously Neanderthal. And the thing that actually distinguishes Neanderthal from Homo sapien is speech. So everyone from Yuval Harari, Dawkins, absolutely. I speak about Bereshit, Yuval Harari to Dawkins. I mean, it's pretty established that speech is what differentiated. So when Neanderthal saw threats, they could only make noises. They could only make sounds, and when they saw threat coming to them. Whereas the Homo sapien, because he was able to articulate and use language, which is one of the most powerful things that we have, he was able to go back to his cave and say, look, you know that little river by the side of the tree down the road or down here? It's dangerous there. So what does that mean? That means that the Homo sapien was able to use a tool which improved its survival value, which improved its chances of surviving. And that's why Homo sapien was able to survive and Neanderthal wasn't, because it wasn't able to communicate threats as well as Homo sapien was. So for me, when you just put all of the things together, God created the world with speech, so to speak. And speech is what differentiates Adam with pre-Adam. And the technology that I'm working in, which is speech bringing things to reality. I don't see those as being separate. I think there is an issue in certain corners of the world, not just in Judaism, where your Torah is informed by new liberal developments in the world. I think that can be a big issue, because the thing that should inform us shouldn't necessarily be theories. But what I take is very much how Saadia Gaon, Harambam, Radak, Ibn Ezra took it with regards to the Torah, which is that anything in the Torah that is divorced from logic. Harambam says it's not something that we should that try to reinterpret. We don't have the authority to. We don't have a Bet Hagadol or Sanhedrin, and that's why you have some issues in Judaism when people take the authority in their own hands. But the concept of reinterpreting something that doesn't mesh with what we know is a reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world That's classical Gaonic, that's classical Sephardi. Because as you know, Harambam, when he had his disagreement with Aristotle with regards to the eternity of the world, he says, look, I'm not reinterpreting the Pesukim about the world being started at a certain point. Not because the Torah says so. He says the Torah says HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a hand in many more places, and we reinterpreted that. He says it's because I just don't think there's enough evidence to say that the world is eternal. However, if there is, we're obligated to reinterpret it. Because for Harambam and for the Hachamim of our Mesorah, and since then the Hachamim of our friends of in the Ashkenazi world, there is no contradiction between HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world and HaKadosh Baruch Hu's word. And I think people need to focus on that more to really understand what it means when the author of the Torah is the author of the world.
So you touched on something that you actually spoke about in your book related to this. You were saying the distinctions that we make, the compartmentalization of these ideas that we try to separate. Can you elaborate on that? And you can explain how that leads us down a path that eventually results in avodah zarah or superstitious thinking?
Yeah, well, I'll preface it with saying I'm not really the authority to claim what's avodah zarah and what's not, because I think we need a Bet Din Hagadol or a Sanhedrin for that. So for everything that I say, it's very much my Amharit's opinion. But what I would say is that I think humans, we're wired to think in compartmentalized fashion. It's essentially how the brain works. But we're also challenged to challenge things that are how our brain works. So there are many primal drives that we have to fight against. So it doesn't mean just because we're wired that way that we should maintain that way. Now, when I talk about compartmentalization, we have to remember the war that the Israelites had essentially with the Egyptians, or the war that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had with the Egyptians with the 10 plagues, was not to do with a physical war, just to do with emancipation of the Israelites. It was very much to do with an ideological war. Yeah. So each of those plagues, and many of the Hachamim speak about this, from Hacham Ben Amozeg to Hacham Faor, Rabbi Sachs recently wrote about it, Hacham Dweck talks about it often. Each of those plagues encroached upon a polytheistic reality of the known world at the time, the Egyptians, and how they viewed reality. Because for the polytheistic people, for polytheistic humanity, everything had its own compartment. Everything had its own god. They had hundreds of gods: the god of sun, the god of rain, the god of animals, the god of this, the god of that. So when we read the Pesukim, we have to realize that what's happened here is that the conception of this polytheistic view of reality was shattered, because suddenly you had this one god, this one entity, existence itself, Matsui Rishon, encroaching upon all these categories that seem to be separate and seem to be powered by separate gods. So essentially what you had was a monotheistic war on polytheism. And this shattered a lot of these superstitious conceptions of the Egyptians, and of course the Israelites, because we know the Israelites were still worshipping all kinds of things. Even during Talmudic times, we have examples of that. So when you read things like that and you understand that this compartmentalized view of reality was essentially what drove, or we can't say anything drove HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's something that we can take from the message of the story of the Exodus and the plagues, we have to start checking, why are we compartmentalizing things? Because again, if the author of the Torah and the author of the world are the same, you don't compartmentalize. What happens when you do compartmentalize? You get to situations where you have this concept of, for example, Kodesh and Chol, right? Things that are holy and things that are kind of mundane or secular, right? I think Rav Kapach, beautifully in one of his Teshuvot on the concept of secular studies, he literally does what I do with these quotation marks. People who are on the podcast can't see me, but I'm doing quotation marks. He says there are those who tend to call things secular studies, certain subjects secular. And he says they're wrong. It's nonsense. Because anything that is used to know God is not just not secular, it's holy. It's kadosh. So that is the milieu, that is the water that many of our Hachamim drunk from the Gaonic times through to the Sfaradim. And we see, for example, Hacham Yaakov Anatoli, one of the very famous Rishonim who wrote Malmad HaTalmidim, which is essentially the covenant and conversation of medieval times. Everyone has Rav Saks's book on Parasha. In those days, it was Malmad HaTalmidim.
You need to tell me how to get a hold of these farm.
Malmad HaTalmidim is on Amazon, actually. You got to get it.
Okay,
you got to get that, yeah.
Afterwards.
And he goes, you climb the the heights of natural sciences, and at the peak you will find Hakadosh Baruch Hu.
Okay.
So there is no distinction there. It's another way of knowing Hakadosh Baruch Hu. This is a clear halacha. Again, Harambam is posek this in the Mishneh Torah, where he says, how do we come to love God? We say it every day in the Shema. What does it mean to love God? He says we come to love God through everything that He's created, including ourselves, through psychology and everything. And you see Ibn Ezra in Yesod Morai saying you can't even get to Torah study before you understand psychology and logic and all these things. So that's why the compartmentalization is an issue. But a filter is not an issue. So people cannot make a distinction, or they suffer to make a distinction, or challenge to make a distinction between compartmentalizing and filtering. Filtering is part and parcel of Torah, and especially of a Hacham, where you need to filter what is reality, what's not, what is healthy for you, what's not. And I think the filtration system requires that thrive mode mentality, because you need a lot of effort to create a filter. And as a result of being in survive mode for so long, we haven't been able to build a filter, or a lot of Hachamim and a lot of the lay people haven't been able to build a filter. So when you can't build a filter and you compartmentalize, what do? You shun. You say we don't study those things. You say it's better safe to just stick with what we do know. And that's very much
fear. It's fear-based.
It's fear-based. There's a lot of fear. That's why in the introduction I call it the fear of intellect. There is a big fear of intellect in many corners, whereas intellect is essentially what our Hachamim say differentiates us between everything else. That is the Selem Elokim. So literally, the divine entity within us, if we could say such a thing without sounding pantheistic, is the intellect. It's phenomenal, but we have this fear of it in many contemporary forms of Judaism, where you can't utilize your intellect. So hold on. So the thing that makes us the image of Hakadosh Baruch Hu is the thing that we're not supposed to use. We sometimes don't sit down and actually think about what these things mean. So we're supposed to not use the thing. When so many of our Hachamim say that not using your intellect, there is no difference between you and an animal. Literally, it's clear. Harambam says this. Many of the Hacham Yaakov Anatoli, Ibn Tibon, Yosef Ibn Kasvi, Hacham Arbajalani, all of that. You're essentially an animal if you don't use your intellect.
I don't think the breast livers listening are going to enjoy that part, but
look, everyone, whether it's everyone has their challenges, but I think that the intellect is fundamental to our conception of who we are. So it's very important that we don't abandon it, but with the right filtration system.
Right. And we try to fill that void, that fear void you were talking about in your book, just to finish on this point, with superstitious ideas, right? The imagination and how that.
Yeah, it's a very, very important point here. And I think it's something we can think about on a very personal level. When we're kids, right? When we're sitting in our bed and it's dark outside of our bedroom, we always ask our mom and dad to turn the lights on. My kids still do it. They want to fall asleep with the lights on. When they turn the lights off, they don't know what's going on outside. So it's that fear of like the unknown almost, right? So when they can't see, they can't know. And when you can't know, you build all types of imaginative stories like monsters. And there are all these scary things and all of these bad things, superstitious ideas, essentially.
Yeah.
So what's happened is that childish mentality of there is this stuff out there. We can't really touch it. We can't really understand it because we're scared of it. Or we can't handle it. What happens from there is that when you don't know about it, what do? You fill that space in your mind, if you like, which hasn't been filled with the right knowledge, with superstition. Why? Because you haven't been able to explore it, you still need to fill that part up to try and, fill in the gaps. That's just a human thing. We need to fill in the gaps of knowledge. But instead of filling it in with reality, with what is, we fill it in with what can be. And that's why Bertrand Russell, famous philosopher, he says beautifully that fear is the main source of superstition. Because when we don't know, we fill it up with all types of scare stories. And that is when you get the slippery slope of Avodah Zarah. And which is why I think one of the main issues with not accepting evolution as a reality, when clearly it's a reality, certain theories of it can be debated, but the grand macro theory of evolution is as reality as gravity is. You're encroaching upon denying Maaseh Bereshit. Because if we know according to reality that is how the world came to be, with the force of HaKadosh Baruch Hu behind it, obviously, because that is Matsui Rishon. And you deny that, you're denying Maaseh Bereshit. And when you're denying Maaseh Bereshit, you're having God on your terms. And when you have God on your terms is when you can start having Avodah Zarah seep in. So it has major ramifications.
Yeah. And I think people have a problem with that idea because they're not really looking at it as a guided development. They're looking at it as some type of random mutation, like really Darwinian idea of it. Whereas even if you subscribe to the idea of, Adam Harishon was a creationist kind of thing where he just came out of nothing. The Midrash says that it happened in different, periods, that it was this part of his body, then that part of his body. It shows that, and even so, even if we want to understand it, God didn't create anything in this world that we see as an immediate, he was the
final
first
product.
Yeah, and his final product. Everything had to have
development.
Had to development from the first cause, so it had to happen through a stage of events. And really, we for some reason people are hung up on this idea, but anyway.
It comes
fear.
from
It comes from fear. None of it is bad. I genuinely don't believe any of it is bad intention. I think, again, it's a product of survive mode Judaism. And I think what's fascinating is that Rav Kook talks about this, Hacham Ben Amozeg, in his book that recently got translated, Israel and Humanity. He has a whole section just dedicated to the development of mankind and how it's so important for us to understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a world for development. Otherwise, everything is static. What's the point of a berit if it's not to develop? Everything is meant to develop, but within a framework.
Right.
And that's the challenge that we've got.
Asher bara Elohim la'asot. We always say this, it's a very...
Maaseh Bereshit is not a moment. It's a continual process. Acham Power talks about this a lot in Golden Doves. So it's an ongoing thing, and we're lucky to be partners in that berit. People forget that we're partners, that we have a role to play as well.
Yeah.
I think it's just one-sided.
So this is going to lead into